So in this session, we are focusing on the complexity that is embedded in natural systems, and we are looking at the algorithmic processes of designing generative systems and centralizing basically around the simulation of differentiated interdependent subsystems for the generation of architectonic spaces in a variety of scales. So basically, we are focusing in this session into system design, we could call, and how to generate dynamic systems and obviously how to represent them. So I will begin with my PhD research, which is related with the session's topic. It's called Generative Processes in Tower Design. And my advisors are George Germinidis, Patrick Schumacher, and Michael Weinstock. So I'll give a brief intro of what I'm dealing with. My research basically focuses on the principles of biological and vernacular models in order to propose computationally generated dynamic systems for the tower typology, with the aim of achieving an integrated model for the tower subsystems that can coherently adapt to their environment. And as such, it is a design research set between architecture, preserves the vision and ambitions of modernism, and it is still defined by standardization, repetition, and segmentation. And this agenda has instigated the potential of the tower to be reduced to binary axioms such as tower and city, circulation and habitation, structure and skin. So basically it is about how to, the conventional way of designing a tower system, it's still based on an additive approach, meaning that each subsystem is considered as a separate layer, and this results in the inefficient use and development of the tower material organization. So due to that reason, we need to look at systems that are capable of co-adaptation and integration, and that's why I started to look at the biological paradigm due to its capability of, let's say, integration and co-adaptation and redundancy. Obviously, there has been a broad body of research on the relationship between nature and architecture throughout history, and this relationship has been made possible by analogy research such as Frey-Otto that we all know. I am in particular dealing with a few biological analogies, the first of which is the bamboo stem and its geometrical properties, and the second one is the idea of bundling and branching constructions. So I have been looking at their mathematical definitions and geometrical organizations and how we could integrate them in a generative approach for the design of tower subsystems. So basically what I would like to achieve is to kind of generate the full potential of differentiation and redundancy, which is found in the fibrous constructions of nature, and to be able to apply this heterogeneous quality that is observed in nature to the tower subsystems. And obviously we know that these heterogeneous multifunctional qualities in nature are not gained afterwards, but they are inherent. So I'm focusing on how the architect could set up a design system to achieve the multifunctional aspects of biological systems. And I'm trying to do that basically in two levels. First of which would be the topological variation within one subsystem, and the second one would be the intersystem differentiation taking between multiple subsystems. So starting from that kind of approach, I have started to work with, let's say, agent-based modeling systems, because the quality of self-organization that we see in the natural world can be achieved with these kind of local agents that are based on very simple rules, but they have the capability of generating unexpected outcomes so that the quality of emergence could be achieved. So the first studies that I began with were basically kind of looking at how we could achieve the geometrical differentiation that we see in the bamboo stem and the bundling systems, and how we could integrate the two. So this is kind of one simple, let's say, experiment of generating, let's say, of achieving the geometrical aspects of how the bamboo stem can be achieved and integrating it with the bundling. And this is another level, another experiment. So these kind of set up the, let's say, general framework of an approach that afterwards could be integrated, and they could build up onto integrate different subsystems. So in the next step would be, after generating the framework, which later on could be the load-bearing structure, how to start to integrate the load-bearing structure with, let's say, different subsystems such as circulation or facade systems. So this is one study where I am actually starting to form a structural framework, and then the structural framework gives also the information to generate a circulation system that is generated around the tower facade, and then another hierarchy that makes the facade system. A more detailed version would be here. So as I said, first of all, generating some basic form for the structural framework, and then making a secondary framework inside that holds the floor plates, which would be tied onto the structural framework. And the next step would be generating a circulation system that would be tied onto the exterior framework. And then finally making a facade system that would again be tied to the circulation and the exterior facade framework. So that's basically what I'm experimenting right now. And what I would like to achieve in the next step is to kind of work more on the vertical differentiation along the structural system, and make different combinations of various subsystems, so that there will be a catalog of design experiments showing how various subsystems can be integrated with each other using the object-oriented approach. Thank you.
Okay, my research deals with computational morphogenesis and mathematical models of achieving it. And I'm looking at achieving what I refer to as urban tissues, which is patches of cities, so an organizational model for that. There's an interdisciplinary field in biology known as mathematical biology, which studies biological forms through physics. This is becoming more and more relevant in the field of architecture because our designs are heavily influenced by forces. As an example, there's a direct relation between the pattern of flow and form of cities and the evolution and organization of city forms as complex systems over time is in many aspects similar to the development of complex living systems in biology. So my research is focused on the process of morphogenesis in biology, which is the process by which living organisms come into being and develop their form. It takes advantage of embryogenesis, which begins from cell differentiation and the organization into tissues and organs. This video captures the early development of a Drosophila embryo, highlighting three important processes that are taking place at the same time. The first is mitosis and cellular differentiation, which is the splitting of the cells, and that's why they multiply. The second is cell signaling, which can't be seen in this video. And the third is the organization of cells into a specific tissue type. which is what's happening right now. So we're able to simulate similar processes through relational models, taking advantage of mathematics, such as reaction diffusion, which is a mathematical model that explains the diffusion of two or more chemicals over time. Another way of doing this is to take advantage of agent-based behaviors. And if I zoom out, there we go. What you see here in this image, in the upper image, formation. So it's the organization of cells over time as aggregates into a coherent body. And on the bottom, it's just using what you saw, just a basic flocking behavior. And we've been able to use that for an urban proposal. And it has very similar qualities in terms of pattern formation and achieving what you need it to do. The second process of morphogenesis is evolutionary development, which diversifies organisms over time. And this image is beginning to show the development of an embryo. And after the embryo gets into a developed organism, it continues developing. It goes through other processes. It's influenced by other factors such as environment and natural selection, which we can begin to simulate again through evolutionary algorithms. So in this image, you're seeing at the bottom, it's a genome structure. It's organizing the steps of the algorithm in a similar manner to a genome in biology. The instructions all come from the same pool of instructions, but what you're beginning to see is under each, let's say, species or each type, you're beginning to see differentiated objects that are being developed. So what I am aiming to do, and this part of my research that I'm at right now, is seeking to take these two processes on the cellular level and the development, the evolutionary development, and to put them into one model and to begin to develop a model through which you can have both going on simultaneously. And what this does, it's a script that I just started working with, where you are able to control the behavior of objects but just manipulating their relation to one another. And the next step then is to begin to control. So what I'm doing right now is I'm either bringing them close into some type of kind of organization, or I'm telling them to kind of get further apart. And the next step now is to develop this model where I begin to give behavioral properties to each object so they know how to self-organize, and once they get into a pack, how to begin differentiating as individuals. Thank you very much. Okay, and now I would like to introduce our next guest, which really does not need an introduction, Greg Lynn. He is the principal of Greg Lynn Forum. He's taught throughout the United States and Europe. Because of his early combination of degrees in philosophy and architecture, he's been involved in combining the realities of design and construction with the speculative, theoretical, and experimental potentials of writing and teaching. He's taught and lectured around the world, from ETH Federal in Zurich. He is the O University professor at the Angewandte in Vienna, currently at UCLA in Los Angeles, and the Davenport professor at Yale University. We're looking forward to his presentation. Greg Lynn.
Okay. So running from here, kind of swap Or put it on top if you want. All right. Okay, so I always tell my graduate students that they'll have one idea while they're graduate students and they'll work on it the rest of their lives. I want to revise it now and say, I had one idea 20 years ago, and now I'm attacking it because I was wrong. And what I want to do is walk through that a little bit now. When I wrote this book, Animate Form, which coincided with the use of a lot of the digital technologies that are now common, journalists started to say that any building designed with spline curves, with computation, should be inherently either moving or smooth and unarticulated. And my response to that was to say, well, no, architecture is about tectonics. And so we can use these animated tools, but we'll do it to animate tectonic frames and to generate geometry, which would result in a language of components, because that's what we do. Well, anyway, I was probably too quick. And I would say that today, it's, I think, been hinted at by a number of the speakers already, that our field is really haunted by this tectonic tradition, and we're probably needlessly haunted by the tectonic tradition. And when I say tectonics, I mean, you know, these qualities, the celebration of details and the proliferation of details, the expression of structure, and primarily translating geometry into structure and doing structural expressionism, and also layering and superposition. So, I mean, here's an example of a semper tectonic hut, where you see all the various layers and you see the structure, but what's most important is you see the geometry and the geometry of the components. So, there was this term I coined for a show at the ICA in Philadelphia called INTRICACY, to try to capture a group of projects. And this term intricacy really was about the last gasp of tectonics, as far as I'm concerned. And I put in blue there, you know, so for AA, I think when I'm saying intricate tectonics, that probably means parametricism or some version of parametrics. And I think Bronco and I could have a long discussion about what this means, but it is probably the celebration of a kind of variation, a controlled variation. I think it is about a kind of an emergent design method where certain kind of design decisions are, let's say, put off or assigned to some kind of optimization. But what's most important to me is intricacy is about keeping the tectonic tradition alive of detail everywhere and the celebration primarily of structure. So I brought three kinds of intricacy as examples: tectonic, what I would call flat pack, and then rustication. Some of this I've shown before at different times, but kind of never all together. Intricacy of tectonics is really about the relationship between frame and cladding, typically. What's most important is that the geometry is almost always materialized in some way as structure. And this is the thing that it's been a revelation to me that I'm kind of done with geometry. I think geometry in architecture has really run its course. It's getting less and less interesting, and construction methods that break structure from the geometry of form are getting more and more interesting to me. So, and I'll show you some examples of that. But so anyway, the tectonic tradition need not be about cladding, but it's really about breaking surfaces down into components and celebrating those components and celebrating the diversity of the components. So, you know, here every member of the structure, every surface of the interior is unique. It's not unique randomly, but it's unique in a series or a pattern. But it really was all generated from surfaces, and those surfaces were then broken down into components, and the components were then celebrated for their individuation. I think when you go to construction by surfaces, which is what I would call this flat pack method, a couple of things change. One is I've been trying to eliminate structure from surface and start to use panels and surfaces as inherently structural elements. The other thing is that over the last 10 years or so, I've been trying to replace mechanical connections with chemical connections. And that's just simply because I look around and all the things that I adore, like airplanes, cars, boats, they don't use bolts and screws and nails and things like that, which I find very medieval. They use glue. So I always try to use glue as much as possible. With these flat pack constructions, the panel or the element, instead of being a discrete element, combines to make some kind of a foamy surface. Most of these things have been materialized as freestanding pavilions and transportable elements. This is a whole lounge that HSBC ships around. Fits in a van. These are these index pavilions we just did, which are going to 10 cities this year. And we actually saved $500,000 in shipping by making these things flat pack. So the budget was 100,000 euros for the pavilions and 500,000 for shipping. And so we're spending 40,000 on shipping, and we spent 300,000 euros on the pavilions. So still saving money and tripling the budget. And they're all built out of carbon reinforced plastic. So they're super lightweight, so you can put them together real easily. But anyway, these are all non-mechanically attached and built as these flat pack things that knock down and pop back up without any structure. That language of flat pack is starting to filter in to bigger scale constructions. This pavilion across from LACMA, where the trellis is all kind of diagrid oriented to the sun, as well as the surfaces. But one of the characteristics of this is still that the geometry is playing a very dominant role. Even though it doesn't have a structural frame, the geometry is playing a role in terms of both scoring and decoration, let's say, of panel, and also as structure of flat surfaces that get assembled. At a certain point, I noticed that a lot of our other architects were doing very interesting things with bricks. And I also happened to be the son-in-law of two very important Baroque art historians and scholars, and was spending a lot of time in Rome with them on the summers and looking at Bernini and talking about rustication. So I tried to figure out what was a way of producing rustic masonry surfaces using digital technology and using lightweight construction. And I had this idea for hollow plastic bricks. It really came from kids' toys that I'll show you in a minute. But we, with Panelite, a company in Los Angeles, came up with this freestanding wall system where we take a modular brick that I designed that has these kind of 3 nodes, and we digitally array those instead of in, let's say, a geometric primitive or form. They're arrayed along animation paths, and we find the intersections of each one of these elements one to another, and then cut them with the robot, and then fit them together in a non-modular way. So it's a modular system of construction, just like a brick, but instead of mortar, the variation is cut with the robot, and then they get bonded, melted together into a monolithic object. And we've done a bunch of these as walls. We did one as a giant brick, where it became kind of self-supporting dome. I then went back to the toys where I had the idea of doing these hollow plastic rotomolded bricks, and we scanned. You can see the dots on there just to do a laser scan, and you get a polygon cloud out of these objects. And again, they get arrayed in patterns, cut, assembled. We did furniture for the Biennale with them. And then the art historian in-laws of mine kept telling me they should be fountains. Oh, it also started to influence bigger scale things. It's a competition for a lecture hall in Vienna. My in-laws kept telling me, you know, these things are wrong as furniture and they're wrong as walls, but they would make great fountains. I didn't totally understand why until I looked at some fountains, and this is Bernini's Trajan's fountain, and it's a little bit out of the picture, but it's 4 tortoises on which are 4 dolphins, and the dolphins are each holding keys in their tails, and then there are 2 shells on the 4 dolphins, plus Trajan, plus he's drinking from another shell. So instead of a sculpture, where Bernini would just do a rustic base and a figure, the fountains were this assemblage of animals and an assemblage of figures. And I realized that was why they kept telling me these things would make good fountains. So this is, that's a photograph of a fountain at the Hammer Museum where we did, I think there's about 80 or so rocking horses, like whale rocking horses, and then a couple of dozen sharks that are being assembled. And the same principle as the furniture, all robotically cut. And another one we did, I also wasn't aware of a thing, the spiral composition of Bernini, where most of Bernini's figures always were making this snake spiral, where the figures were always gesturing in some way as a spiral. So these are all animated along 2 counter spiral paths. The bricks that make the base are animated in a clockwise direction, and the sharks are in a counterclockwise direction, and the 2 spirals intersect on each other. And so all of the composition is done not defining a geometric surface and turning the center lines into members, but in fact it's using some kind of path-generated assembly, a lot like this Port Authority project from way back. Okay, but so for me, those 3 kinds of intricacy, the tectonic, the flat pack, and the kind of rusticated masonry style of intricacy are really looking to maximize detail and maximize intersection and complex intersection. And at a certain point, it really came from products. I started to get a lot of pushback on that. And what's interesting is in the building industry, we're not getting that pushback. But if you go talk to, say, Rolf Fellbaum at Vitra and say, look, I've been seeing your chairs and I notice you make your chairs out of maybe 20 parts. And I've got this new software and I've got BIM and I've got, you know, generative algorithms. I've got a way to make your chair out of 2,000 pieces. That's like the last meeting you have with Rolf Fellbaum, because that world of industrial design doesn't see that as progress. They see progress as, I found a way to make a chair out of 2 pieces. So I realized there was a kind of innovation that could take place with a kind of minimalism and reduction of components rather than a maximization of components and details. And it was really that started to lead towards a kind of, let's say, integration of function and integration of structure into fewer and fewer curved elements. You know, I won't go through all this, but with the lessee, with the teapots, the only requirement was that I put handles on them. And so this teapot became all handled in the sense that it's 2 skins, one skin you grip and another skin that's a hot flask. And all of the construction of the teapot, the base, the flask, the spout, the grip, all of it got integrated into a surface. And very late, I forgot I was supposed to design a tray. And so the tray does a similar thing where when the tray can be flipped. When it's sitting up like this, everything nests in the tray. When you flip it over, all these surfaces correspond to these curves, so you can lay it open like a flower. Same thing with the cups. It becomes all handle. So what would have been made out of several pieces and several molds gets integrated into fewer and fewer surfaces. With the ravioli chair, same idea, that there's a soft top, which is all computer knitted fabric. So it's not even built out of separate pieces of fabric that get sewn together. It's a digitally knitted surface. And then the base, instead of having legs, is all made out of one composite. There's a few more things in the construction than just two surfaces, but basically it's moving towards integrating lots of functions and elements into fewer and fewer components. This table for the Mac, where you can store all of your plates and dishes and bowls in the surface of the table, the thickness of the table. So just looking to ask for more function, but accommodate it with fewer components and fewer surfaces. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of this stuff was all trying to look at the work that surfaces could do that tectonics couldn't. The other thing is that there's a kind of ergonomics that goes with this, which is that not only you have a different affection for the surfaces and spaces because of this, and you have a different orientation to them, but also that they integrate things like furniture, kitchen equipment, bath equipment. They integrate mechanisms into the architecture in a new way. So this is Osplin's bench at the Woodlawn Chapel, which is where I kind of first got this thought. And for this house, the Bloom house, the space I wanted to make was really like a loft, like a kind of a free plan modern space, but very cozy, so that you would feel like you had rooms, but never really be in a room. So the living space, the dining space, the breakfast nook, the kitchen, this home office, it's all part of the same room, but it's all folded and molded out of surfaces. The same thing, the windows and everything is all kind of snapped and integrated into a few simple lines. So it's also a place where I started using a lot of plastics at the building scale, unlike, say, the blob wall. So this is all fiber reinforced plastic. The interiors, this is all plaster, like form work with plaster over the top to kind of swallow the hearth into the wall. And then there's a lot of Corian surfacing, which integrates, instead of pulls and handles and things, everything is accommodated with the logic of deforming surfaces. The furniture, like this breakfast nook table. And then in the bathrooms, all of the wet equipment, like the sinks and the vanities and everything, were all absorbed into these surfaces. So anyway, and what I realized with all of this work on surfaces is that I was no longer trying to articulate the geometry in the construction. The geometry was controlling the form, and the structure was either backfilling it or, in a lot of cases, overlaying it with a totally different logic. And I started to play around with material changes across surfaces which were irrelevant to the geometry. So, this, which is the same form and the same geometry in two different materials, one, this kind of translucent fiberglass, and the other, fiber reinforced concrete, or fiber reinforced cement. I've got this Swarovski jewelry that I just did, which does the same thing with ceramic and metal, where the two things arbitrarily break material across a monolithic surface. This facade that we're doing for Site Santa Fe in New Mexico, where we're plugging these composite elements into all the openings around the building. And even more than a change in geometry on the surface, there are a few projects where we're starting to look at the structure in terms of load path and stress instead of looking at the structure in terms of the geometric frame. And first one is this, these hanging surfaces we did with north sails for Swarovski, where we located carbon and aramid fibers along load paths and then sandwiched it with 30 million crystals and cooked it into these big kind of semi-rigid shells, which you can see here. The other are these chairs that we're doing using a tape technology of carbon, where we take very, very thin, fragile, pre-impregnated carbon tapes and lay them up in a schedule of orientations based on their load and put them on a rigid tool. It's just a foam tool that we cut in my office. And then you put it in a bag and you cook it at a couple hundred degrees, and it consolidates all these fibers. And you end up getting these hanging chairs, which, unlike a piece of fabric, work as a compression shell under their own load. So they hang in space as a rigid shell, and they hold the shape of the mold you put them on. But the minute you sit on them and you overcome their strength to act as a compression shell, they turn into a fabric. So they're these really amazing things that you can hold them and flip them around and throw them to somebody and they'll be a rigid shell. But the minute you load them, they turn into a fabric. And you could also crumple it up and more or less put it in your backpack or FedEx it. Then is exercise. I'm doing this project with a naval architect who's now full-time in the office to work with software that deals with projectiles, and to work with a construction which is purely load path based and composite. And so I'm doing, this is a boat that I'm designing for myself. It has a very strange brief, which is I have to be able to sail it alone with my kids. I got to be able to spend the night on it. I would like to set the record from Los Angeles to Hawaii with double-handed racing with it. And I for sure have some records I have to set up and down the California coast with it. So it's like deciding you're going to make a Formula One car with 4 doors to take your kids to school and go camping in. So, but I think given all those compromises, it should work. But what's good is I'm calling in every favor I can. The computational fluid dynamics is being done by a company called CFD Max, which works mostly in the building industry, but they are, for the first time, are looking at the interaction of air and water at the same time. Nobody's ever done that. Usually the sail designers design the sails for the air, and they get loads and force, and they give it to the naval architects, who then look at the fluid dynamics in terms of the water. Well, they're doing everything at once, which really is useful to give us all the loads and stresses and the balance of the boat. It also is very useful in terms of the surfacing of the boat. What we did find out, what you could see here, is every time we would run this, and this is like the old days in the sense that we send something off to a 60 computer cluster, it takes them 5 to 7 days to give us information back. Once we have the information, we could look at it in a lot of ways, but it's not interactive. It's anything but. And what we'd find out is after 7 days, we get something back like this, like the boat flying straight up out of the water. But what we found is that we had so many variables and nobody driving that we would change one of these variables and set the boat off sailing in this virtual environment, And it would always end in catastrophe, just like it would be if you trimmed the sails and blocked off the helm and sent your boat off into the ocean. It would end in catastrophe. So it really became a question of limiting the variables. We were all excited we had so many variables to play with, but incrementally we had to lock down more and more of them to get good answers. But so this is what happens if the boards for the boat are too far forward. It starts to stand up on its end. So anyway, but out of this analysis, which was about, probably we spent definitely more than 6 months running all this computational fluid dynamic analysis, what we would get is, information like this, which is flow separation, which is a very bad thing, or unattached flow, and we would get stresses on the structure. So out of this, the naval architect, Fred Karubla, would then tell me, we need to change these surfaces and rerun them. And what was interesting is out of the dialogue between a naval architect with intuition about how things would behave, and me with no real idea about what I was doing, but ideas about surfacing and the computational fluid dynamics, we started to come up with things that hadn't been done, but which make a lot of sense. So like this strake is something most boats like this will have to shed the water off. But a concave surface like this, most won't have. But it turns out when the boat buries in the water and you want it to pop back up, this surface turned out to be a better surface than a flat surface. Or the kind of axe shape, which was purely to look like a Japanese sword, turned out to be very successful in punching through waves. So there were all kinds of styling things which were not the consequence of optimization, which turned out to have consequences. And that's the one thing I would say is that this field is less scientific than architecture. It's very much common sense and trial and error. And the computer gives you consequences to everything you do, but it doesn't give you solutions. So, but that's really the power of the CFD analysis, is it shows you how everything you're doing is going to have consequences within a limited set of variables. Anyway, but one of the big things about this is that I didn't mention that it has to be really sexy in the boat world, which is a very unsexy world. I mean, really nobody since Philippe Stark in the 80s has thought about doing something new in boat design, so it's a really easy place to be a success. One just funny thing that's here just for Brett. Because I ended up with all these America's Cup people working on this stupid boat project, I was asked as a favor to do some styling for the America's Cup buoys. And right now they have these boats, which are marks, which are robotically controlled. Nobody drives them. They just put into an iPad where they go, and they just go there. They cost a couple $1,000,000. So they said, could I do some buoys? And with Bill Chrysler, we came up with this buoy. Sorry, let me skip through the interiors and stuff. It's the first robot I ever designed. So, so there's the buoy. And I was just kind of asked to make it look good and put a display on it and wind speed and GPS and all that stuff. And the plan is there's 12 of these that get put around San Francisco Bay. And they have thrusters in them that will move them side to side and hold position so they don't have an anchor. And Stan Honey, the guy who invented the yellow line on the sports field and stuff, is a technical person behind these. But it's the same technology as these robotic boats. But there's a thing called displacement hull speed, which means that if this is a meter around, it'll only go 1 mile an hour. And so it would take these poor things like 2 hours to get out to the course. And so we were going to make them really light so we could throw them in a boat. And I said, well, why don't they just, and this is where design is always worth something. I said, why don't we just have them lie down and we'll just make this shape more or less like a displacement hull. So the batteries that run the electric thrusters shift and the thing falls down and then they all go out to the course like a bunch of torpedoes. But so anyway, I'm sure a cellular algorithm would have found this fast because it wouldn't know what it was doing. Would have knocked itself down and found out it suddenly had 20 feet of water line. instead of 2.5 feet. But anyway, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Our next speaker is someone who has also been very influential for my research, Mark Sarkisian. Just to give a brief introduction, Mark is the director of SOM. He has developed engineering solutions for over 100 building projects around the world, including some of the tallest and most complex. Mark holds 4 US patents for high-performance seismic structural mechanisms and has patents pending for seismic and environmentally responsible structural systems. He is the author of Designing Tall Buildings, Structure as Architecture, and currently he is teaching at UC Berkeley, California College of the Arts, Stanford University, and Cal Poly. Thanks a lot, Mark, again.
Thanks, Elif. I'll start by saying it's a great pleasure to be here. I have been following the work of Michael and the group, and I think it's wonderful, and what a great opportunity the students here have to learn from some of the greatest. And it's a great forum. It's great to be part of it. I'm going to talk today about work in progress, and I'm going to talk about scale, I suppose, difference in scale perhaps in what you've seen. And I'm going to talk about an application of some ideas to built work and perhaps ideas yet to come. I think of flow as really motion, perhaps as a continuum, and it's a transformation that perhaps happens during a period of time. But ultimately, for me, it leads to what I'll call systems. I think our work is based on technology of the time. In the 60s, it was about discovering that braced frames in buildings was a very efficient way to deal with wind and seismic forces. But perhaps we're at the stage in development where natural forms are much more important, and not just because they're beautiful, but because they teach us something about structure. Most of us, when we see the hurricane, we think of it in plan, and we know it's an applied force, but how many of you think about it as a resistant mechanism, and how many perhaps think about it acting vertically rather than horizontally, and perhaps three-dimensionally? So the idea of a resistance that mimics the behavior of the hurricane is something that I think shows us that perhaps efficient structures can come from these ideas. Mathematics is beautiful. It's something that defines form, but more importantly, it defines efficiency. So we've been studying the idea of this type of growth. And it's complex, but based on very similar principles. I have a question. Who knows where, in a plant, in the northern hemisphere, who can guess where the first leaf points? And there's probably a bunch of people out here that know a lot more about this than me. South. See that? South. And why south? Well, south is the place where it's going to see the most sun. So, but I have another question. For most plants, now there are several species, but for most, where does the next leaf form? It is almost east. You're right. It's 137.5 degrees off of the first position. Okay? And you say, well, why is it 137.5 degrees? Well, the reason for it is because no leaf that grows after that first leaf will ever directly cover the previous leaf. The reason why it's important is because these mathematics, I think, can be learned from, and perhaps we think of them in our structures. So tall buildings, the idea of bracing systems that perhaps mimic the Fibonacci sequence. And the idea is that these systems, in this case, resist only lateral loads, not vertical load, not gravity load. Gravity load, we talked about that earlier, in systems that you could have dual systems where one system is taking the weight and the other system is taking the earthquake or the wind. And what we found was this change in geometry, this flattening of the frame and the density of the frame actually resulted in a much more efficient structure. It's about the flow that we saw through those elements, equalizing in some ways the stress along those elements as the elements were supported by their foundations. And forms that perhaps are aggressive, but perhaps doable. I wonder what Behrens had in mind. Was it aesthetics, or was it light? I've been thinking about this. I wonder about the masters and what perhaps they had in mind in these designs. And I wonder if it's about deciphering something and thinking about art and something that perhaps is asymmetrical, that you could use a super frame idea in a tall building and infill that frame asymmetrically in an area of high seismicity and use those infill frames in a way that helps diffuse energy and protect the larger frame. And use that frame to manage light, to control the light on the spaces, to control heat gain. And perhaps it can be done with systems that are perhaps more repetitive, but also provide the same idea of control of heat, and instead of just resisting, in this case, gravity loads and lateral loads, but providing a multiple set of functions. Light's mysterious. It's one that I'll say is of discovery. It's about a transition of space and a feeling of space and perhaps an inspiration of space. It's about a love affair with an architect, or maybe not. You know, it's about a goal of what you set out to achieve, whether it's materials or in this case a combination of materials and light. 90,000 holes define the image of Christ. So as the light moves behind it, the image appears. As the light moves and breaks in front of it, the image disappears. So again, a way to create a space and a reaction to light. I think there's more to it, and I don't have it all solved, but I think light is something that exists in waveform, as do structures. So as we set out to design our structures for their optimal shape under compression, we see the modes of vibration, if you will, or modes of buckling of that element. When we set out to design a concept where these very thin elements would be draped with tension members, and the members themselves would resist only compression, very, very tall and very slender members, to create a space that was really about the light, about a structure that was absolutely minimal. Started to think about the relationship, and this is what's called the Mori effect, and it's a visual effect. It's a pattern that gets created by the relationship of structure. I started to wonder what this pattern might mean. And in the early 1800s, there was a man named Thomas Young who discovered a way to measure the wavelength of light. And it was based on minimum and maximum, dark and light spaces. He's the same Thomas Young that came up with a constant that's essential to elastic theory of structures. It's E, Young's modulus. I started to think that there might be a relationship between light and strain. And in fact, there is. The idea of positive and negative space, the idea of wave theory, it's all interrelated. So the way we define light and the way we define structure is based on the same basic principles. So I wonder if there is a relationship between structures that we don't see, that is intangible. And perhaps there's an energy that's created that we're getting just a clue of it through these waveforms. There's a strengthening as the structure is interacting and a weakening when it's not. And we can take this theory and use it, maybe not quite yet, but soon, hopefully, in the idea that structures are made up of elements that are fine. They're more mesh-like than beams and column-like. And the idea of creating a structure that resists individually only axial load without bending. So for us as structural engineers and architects, that's the most efficient way to an individual element or fiber level to come up with the most efficient structure. When you look at this, what do you see? This is what I see. It's fractal. It's the members in between that I think are the clue to how you might create a structure that has fluid forces and a distribution that uses all of its structural elements before it hits the ground. It's an interconnection of these elements with vertical elements that then provide shading and so forth on the southern facade of this building. It's not an idea that comes right away. It's something that is somewhat experimental in trying to achieve something that allows for force flow, but also the most efficient use of the structure and hopefully something that's beautiful aesthetically. It comes down to a practical answer for us. I mean, we can't build something that isn't defined. And certainly at this scale, it does come down to these kinds of drawings where you have core systems and you have this screen system that gets load from outriggers that interconnect with it when the building moves laterally. But as those loads get into that frame, they distribute down and equalize and activate all the vertical elements before these forces get to the ground. So the definition of form. You know, we're making small steps the way I see it. There's parametric modeling. There's geometric modeling that's the heart of it, at least today. And these forms are beautiful and can be built at great scales. In this case, you can see the modules, the formwork modules that were used to create the form, overall form. But defined in digital project, transferred to a formwork contractor, and then built. So this is a combination of fluid form, a material like concrete that can be used in a way that everything that you see is structure. It's vertical load carrying structure, it's lateral load resistance. It controls the harsh sun on the southern facade, which you see in elevation. It's about carving and making spaces in that wall that allows for indirect light so that the spaces are filled with light but not filled with heat, for instance. The definition is complex but buildable. The base of the building, the idea that there could be a 20-meter lobby space where columns would come down and be braced by a lamella structure that could be defined first analytically and then parametrically with the models used for the forming systems. So these forms are, I think, in some small ways of the future, and they're possible today. I think the idea of dynamically defining structure is very important, and I think a lot of the work that's being done here is focused on things like this. And the idea of looking for the most efficient structure, whether it's completely in compression or there's a combination of compression and tension, but how do we look at these things in a way that helps inform our final shapes and those forces that we need to design for? You know, I think that this idea is allowing us to be much more, I'll say much more fluid, much more open with the responses that we can get and build. Straight segments. He's from this university, Andrew Cutlass, who was mentioned earlier. There's a project that was just done with smart geometry at Rensselaer. David Schuck is somebody from our office that has developed a relationship with Andrew and has helped him with some of the engineering related to this. This is something that interests us very much. And Mark is from Cal Poly. Again, the idea of creating, in this case, it was another effort that happened over a week's time, and it's sort of an idea that's based in theory, then built. Our cities, I think, are in need of reconsideration. So we think about the cellular form, we think about the city as perhaps as a cell, we think about the efficiency of cities, both the placement of buildings, but probably most importantly, their effects on the environment. And so can we take this geometry that we're studying and apply it to something that's much more comprehensive? Elif, she's mentioning that, she's looking at multiple parameters. It's exactly where I think we should be heading. So thinking about form, building efficiency, which is taking, it's taking the structure that we would anticipate, and it's looking at what the mechanical systems perhaps are, and what's left. What is the efficiency of the building? How do we sell the idea to a client who is ultimately going to be selling the space? Carbon, the idea of carbon, it's a serious issue, and it's something that I think we're just scratching the surface on, but the idea of defining carbon at the time of construction is very important. As a matter of fact, most of these buildings that we design, it takes 20 years for the carbon associated with the operation of the building to catch up with the initial carbon that goes into the building when we build it. Solar effects, how much light we're getting, all this stuff is something that we think is important to consider interactively right in the beginning of the project, and it can be refined as we move through the project and have a better handle on form, structure, and exposure. So, a couple of questions. Are cities ordered by the streets that manage flows of vertical and pedestrian movements where the areas in between are void and absent of life? Should our structures be restricted to regular load paths defined by elements set up on disciplined grids, ignoring the spaces between, ignoring their contributions only because an order has been imposed upon us? Should our structures be designed as static objects or as objects that are in continuous motion? Should we continue to think of our structures two-dimensionally instead of volumetrically? We've got it all wrong. I mean, we are designing buildings for earthquakes with fixed joints and frames. We're still doing it. We're not allowing our buildings to move in a big earthquake. And these things take a long time to get built, but the idea of joints and buildings that behave much more like the joint in your body than, and it's crude. The idea is crude, if you think about it. And the reason why it's crude is because we're using building materials that most contractors don't want to give up. Plates and wide flange beams and columns. But the idea of using a pin and a curved connection that's clamped together with friction type connection, and when the load is high enough, the joint will move. Instead of deforming and yielding and failing the base material, the idea is that the energy is dissipated through this friction surface. Allowing buildings to behave naturally. The flow of force, the flow of movement, the idea that these models can be taken at a very simple level and then built something that's very complicated. Emergence is something that probably of any place in the world, this is the place where you've been thinking about it the most, largely due to Michael's work and his interests. And I am far from an expert, but I see the idea as being something that's so important to our work. The idea of cities, the interactions of whether it's birds or the motion of and the results of sand influenced by flow, in this case air movement, this synergy of people that create something that's far more powerful than otherwise they would do on their own. And this phenomenon that exists around us about the attraction or repulsion of elements relative to a force that exists. And can we take these ideas and apply them to structure where we have boundary conditions and we have force? And then we have a way of trying to come up with the most optimal placement of material within that structure, regardless of its form. Removing areas where we don't need structural elements relative to both of those conditions, both the boundary conditions and the forces. But maybe we need to be thinking about it three-dimensionally instead of on a surface. How many of us, when we design a building or think about a building, think about the surface? We should be thinking about the space in between and how those forces would flow from that three-dimensional shape. The results and the solution are not so clear yet, but I think it's a way of thinking that's important. It's about what's left over. What's the strong, what has the greatest strength, the greatest resistance? And you know, we can apply these things to structures. We can take concrete and we can erode it where in areas where the applied forces don't require the material. We can do it on a multi-story level. We can do it in buildings that erode over their height, so the architecture is affected, not just the structure. And it's done in a rational way where the demands are less as we go toward the top. And perhaps the views, I would argue, without a doubt, are more important. So it's about placement of material. It's about the boundary conditions. I think it is about flow of how those forces move through a structure that's thought of much more as an object, as in this case a membrane, and it's a reaction. And it's where we are today is there's a practical reaction to this force flow that finds itself as a result of this in a frame, but in the future perhaps it'll be something that's much more fluid. So, what if structures in the future could be designed for the basic sustained forces by using the material internally flowing in response to transient loading, increasing densities in areas where necessary? So in other words, we design for the base case, right? And that's gravity. Unless something really changes, gravity is what we've got to design for. But what if the material within that structure could be moved to respond to loading? What if the behavior was three-dimensional, considering the volume of the structure rather than just its perimeter? And then finally, what if the behavior emerged through a central controlling force of collective intelligence? And it's happening. These ideas are being developed. They're being developed here. The idea of motion and interaction, dynamics. So in this case, simply introducing air in the cylinders in the handrails of this carbon fiber bridge changes the behavior. And it can be done for not just carbon fiber bridge, but for very tall buildings, buildings of different shapes, structures of different shapes. And finally, you know, it's sort of, as opportunities come up, you wonder if there are further opportunities that we might consider. You know, sort of a futuristic idea of what these structures might be. Maybe the idea that these structures have material within their frames that do a lot more than just resist load. And maybe the material within that structure can be modified over time. Maybe it can be a system that interacts very closely with other elements like the exterior wall system or the mechanical systems. The idea that every single element has at least two roles to play. The idea that buildings aren't just consumptive, but they can regenerate. These are the things that we're thinking about. The idea that these structures are more like instruments, that there's something very beautiful about its form, perhaps, but also about the way we deal with forces, in this case, an exterior wall system that might use a very minimal tensile net that could be strung over the frame to carry the glass loads and wind loads. Maybe it's about a state change of material. So the idea that material could be placed, and you can imagine that material could be placed within a tubular structure, and in a very simple way, simple terms, the idea of going from a liquid to a solid changes its stiffness. There's an external force that needs to be applied, but it changes its stiffness by using uses the same basic materials that exist. So, I think the field is wide open in terms of what types of material could be used, but the concept is one of a state change that perhaps leads to the most efficient ideas. That's what I have. Thank you for your time.